"Wait, Mary, it's me." My ex-husband and my son's wife eloped 10 years ago, and they have been missing ever since. I didn't want to think about them, let alone see them, but for the first time in 10 years, he contacted me. My ex-husband called me and demanded, "I'm going to live at your parents' house now. You still live with your parents, don't you? I apologize for contacting you like this, but you need to leave my house." I was taken aback by his request. We hadn't spoken in 10 years, and I had no idea what he wanted. But he was asking for my parents' house to live in with his unfaithful partner. "I see you're still living with your parents, but have you remarried yet?" he asked. "Get out of there as soon as possible." For the first time in 10 years, I became enraged at my ex-husband, who was mocking me even more. Fortunately, he was unaware that my living situation had changed over the previous 10 years. "I'm sorry, but if it's my parents' house, it's gone," I said. "Huh?" I reminded him this for the first time in 10 years. I was determined to succeed. Mary Kane is my name. I am 60 years old and work as a part-time teacher in a private school. Even though I have reached retirement age, I continue to work part-time, albeit with a lower annual salary. Perhaps it was because of my childhood memories that I admired my parents, who were well-known teachers, and I grew up aspiring to be like them. I had a husband, Stephen, but we divorced 10 years ago. And now, after 10 long years, that man, whom I thought I'd never see again after such a bad breakup, unexpectedly called. I met Stephen in college when I was 21 years old. I was working part-time as a teacher at a tutoring center while also studying to be a teacher. Stephen was a new part-time teacher who had recently joined the center. He was older than me, but I had been there longer, so the director asked me to train him. As I trained him, we became good friends and eventually began a relationship. We married after 3 years of dating and had a son, Michael. After graduation, I found a full-time teaching job and left the tutoring center. Our life together was just beginning. After 25 years, Michael married Sarah, whom he'd met at a design school in New York. We congratulated Michael on his marriage and spent our days hoping that they would build a happy family together. Then, Michael unexpectedly returned home and wanted to confide in me. He had been working as a prototype designer, specializing in figurines, and hadn't been home in a long time. But it seemed that something was bothering him. "You know, Mom, you're married to Dad, aren't you?" he asked. "Yes." I was thrilled to see him, but began to worry. "I saw Dad walking around Brooklyn with Sarah the other day," he explained. "Okay." Apparently, he saw Sarah walking arm in arm with Stephen last Friday night, and in Brooklyn's hotel district. Michael was on his way home from work when he saw them and became suspicious. He followed them and saw them walk into the hotel. I couldn't believe it. Even though they are in-laws, Stephen and Sarah are as close as real father and daughter. However, meeting privately and alone was odd. And even less in a hotel? No way. I was hoping it was a misunderstanding or a bad dream, but there was evidence. The phone screen Michael showed me had a clear image of Stephen and Sarah walking into the hotel arm in arm. And speaking of Friday nights, Stephen arrived home late. He claimed it was overtime at his office, but I guess that was a complete lie. Furthermore, I remembered that Stephen had been arriving home late on an increasing number of days in the last few months. He claimed it was because of happy hour with his colleagues, an unexpected business trip, or working on a holiday. I initially believed him. However, when I considered it calmly and carefully, I realized that aside from happy hours, there had been almost no unexpected business trips, overtime work, or work on holidays up until now. I felt uneasy that these had increased lately. Was it all a ruse to spend more time with Sarah? I asked Michael to send me the image, then told him I'd talk to his father about it before sending him on his way. I waited for Stephen to get home that night. He returned late at night, smelling strongly of alcohol. The smell of alcohol upset me, but I boldly approached him and said, "Stephen, I saw Michael this afternoon. Is it true that you met with Sarah last Friday?" Yes, we briefly met, and I recall talking about it." The question had woken him up, and his eyes began to dart. Seeing my reaction, he went on to ask, "What did he say?" "He also said that he saw you and Sarah walking into a Brooklyn hotel together." I held up the picture Michael had given me as I said this. Stephen's eyes widened. He choked up, and his eyes darted even more, as if searching for an escape route. He sighed deeply, as if giving up, after I was convinced that his reaction was correct. "I can't believe Michael noticed me. I was overjoyed. I guess I got carried away a little." "No way, Stephen." "Well, I guess it's pointless to make excuses now." Stephen began to confess everything. He admitted that he began dating Sarah 6 months ago after being swayed by her advances. He told me that his feelings were now primarily for her. 6 months ago, Michael and Sarah celebrated their 3rd wedding anniversary. Had Stephen and Sarah begun dating at that time? Despite my trembling surprise, Stephen continued to confess. "That is why I desire to marry Sarah. Mary, I want a divorce." I objected vehemently to the words, nearly losing my mind, but Stephen continued. "In any case, I'm divorcing. I can't do it with you any longer." The next day, he never came home. Furthermore, Stephen's belongings were missing from the house, and a completed divorce decree was on the table. Later, Stephen received a phone call from Michael, who was crying because Sarah had left the divorce papers and vanished. I assumed she had no intention of returning. I was stunned when Stephen and Sarah eloped and vanished. That was the conclusion of Stephen and I's divorce 10 years ago. After the divorce, Stephen and I sold the house we had been living in, and I moved into a new house I found near my workplace. I was depressed by myself immediately after the move, but as I busied myself with work, I realized that my emotional wounds had completely healed. I believe that because teaching was a rewarding job for me, I was able to heal my emotional wounds before I realized it. It must have been significant that I continued to devote myself to a single rewarding job, was allowed to work part-time at a school even after retirement, and spent active days not only with my colleagues, but with my students. I spent less and less time worrying about Stephen and Sarah as I continued to enjoy my teaching job and interactions with students. After 10 years, I no longer reflected on my time with Stephen. My income had dropped since becoming a part-time teacher, but it was still sufficient for me to stay at the school and be with my students who adored me like a parent. I'm also relieved to hear that Michael has thrown himself into his work with zeal, having recovered from the shock of his father's and wife's betrayal. A phone call, however, shattered any semblance of peace I had found. "Hello?" "Mary, it's Stephen here." "Stephen?" It was the first time in 10 years I had heard my ex-husband's voice. I thought I'd never hear it again, but when I did, I couldn't help but scream. "What do you want right now? You didn't come here to talk about the good old days, did you?" Unintentionally, my words came out stronger than I expected, but that was completely understandable. I hadn't spoken to Stephen in 10 years, and no matter how hard I tried, he is the one who insisted on the divorce. Stephen, who had somehow managed to keep his emotions under control and maintain a sense of normalcy, remembered this and said to me, Hey, what do you want from me? Why did you contact me? You are the reason we are divorced. I no longer consider you my husband, and I don't want to see you or even hear your voice." "Okay, now let me get to the point. You're back at home, aren't you? I'm sorry to interrupt you in this manner, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I couldn't control my emotions and had to raise my voice again, grasping the meaning of the words said insensitively and lightheartedly. Stephen kept talking, oblivious to the fact that I was confused and trembling with rage. "Sarah is having a baby," he continued, "but having a child is more expensive than I anticipated. Making a living is becoming increasingly difficult." According to Stephen's story, despite their 30-year age difference, they had been a passionate couple. However, Sarah became pregnant last year, which changed everything. Stephen and Sarah both quit their jobs prior to their elopement, and no decent company would hire them if they tried to find new work. They had to work part-time jobs to make ends meet, and they had been living day by day. Sarah was unable to work after becoming pregnant and giving birth, putting the family's finances in jeopardy. I couldn't take care of her any longer, so we discussed turning to Michael or my parents for help. But Michael refused to see me, and my parents disowned me. They're all so stubborn. Stephen laughed on the phone, and I saw in my mind's eye the faces of Stephen's parents and younger brother, whom I had gone to greet before their marriage 13 years before. His family consisted of a strict-looking father, a strong-willed mother, and a serious-looking younger brother. We never spoke again after the divorce, but I didn't think he was the type of man who would let Susan be unfaithful to him or to run off with his own son's wife. So, are you suggesting that I stay in our house? I said yes. The first thing you should do is make sure you have a good relationship with your wife. I'm sure your eldest daughter and the first grandchild is more important than a single woman whose only merit is being a teacher. Get the hell out of here. I felt my anger boiling over at once at his abusive tone. Had my memories of Stephen over the past 10 years been too glorified? I had not expected him to be such a lax man. And at the same time, I remembered something. I said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, but if it's my parents' house you're speaking of, it's gone." "What do you mean?" "My father passed away 3 years ago, and my mother last year. So my parents' house is too big for me to live in, and I decided to sell it to someone else. I don't have the house to give, Stephen." "Huh?" "I'm not going to tell you where I live now, and even if I did, I wouldn't let you in, so don't come here. Don't ever come here." It was Stephen's turn to shout. "What about my inheritance? When your parents die, the family home and the money should go to me, right?" I frowned in anger at Stephen's words, who only tried to talk about my parents' death in calculating terms. From the looks of things, he must have been planning to steal not only my money, but also my parents' inheritance with an eagle eye, while saying something about relying on my parents' family. However, it was already too late to take the chance. I received all the money from my parents' inheritance along with my parents' house. Both my father and mother said they wouldn't leave a penny to a shameless man who eloped with their daughter-in-law. 10 years ago, on the day Stephen and I divorced, my parents were furious when they heard about Stephen and Sarah's betrayal from Michael and I. It was understandable for them to be angry. They had known Stephen and Sarah since before they were married and had been kind to Stephen as if he was their own son. They trusted him, but he had committed the worst betrayal of all. So the first thing my parents did before they died was to arrange their estate and prepare a will. My parents prepared a will so that everything, including the family home, would be inherited by me in case Sarah came back someday when she realized. 7 years later, my father passed away. My mother passed away last year, and I inherited the family home and estate. And although I did not want to give up my parents' house because it was too big for one person to live in, and because it still had memories of my parents, I decided to sell it, following their wishes. They hoped I would use it to house someone sensible rather than give it to people like Stephen and Sarah. When Stephen heard this, he exploded. "Don't play dumb with me, you bitch. Don't be silly. There's no way they'll forgive you for that." "I inherited the property by legal means," I said. "And there's no way they'll forgive me if I did this. I don't have to be dictated to by Stephen and Sarah, who did nothing and wandered around elsewhere as they pleased." Stephen, who had been doing nothing and wandering around, had no right to interfere with my life. I then stared down at my phone, which had been disconnected from the call. I had no idea that Stephen would abandon others for his own selfish reasons, come to me for help, and then lash out when he doesn't get his way. I had no idea that my ex-husband, with whom I had spent several years of my life, could be so lax and childish. Just as I was feeling my heart's deepest contempt, I received a phone call from Sarah as well. I didn't hear that my parents were dead even though they were my in-laws. She accused me of being so heartless as not to tell her. Sarah yelled at me, but she never touched my heart. If Sarah was truly shocked by the death of my parents, she should have said something like, "I want to offer a gift," or "I want to visit their grave sites." But she showed no sign of saying such a thing, and in her second sentence, it became apparent that she was only thinking about her inheritance, legacy, and money. That is why neither this woman nor Stephen deserved to sit in front of my parents' altar. Thinking this, I quietly rattled off a few choice words before Sarah could finish. Then later, I received a call from Michael. Mom, did my father and Sarah go over there? No, they didn't, but they called asking about my parents' house and their inheritance. Hearing my answer, Michael sighed on the other end of the phone. I see. I thought they may contact you since they came to my place the other day. Michael, are you all right? Did they do anything to you? I'm fine, Mom. Those guys just banged on my door and made a big fuss, and when I told them I was going to call the police, they simply ran away. But I have an idea. Michael shared his idea with me. Hearing this, I decided to break the karma cycle between Stephen and Sarah here, not only for myself, but also to protect my son, who was starting a new life. A few days after I carried out this idea, I received another phone call from Stephen, sounding terribly upset. Hey, Mary, did you do this too? You're not very talkative all of a sudden, are you? What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, they're coming to our house right now. They? According to Stephen, 7 women are coming to the apartment where he and Sarah are living. These women are Stephen's unfaithful partners. He had been having affairs with 7 other young women in addition to Sarah. Sarah was unaware that Stephen was cheating on her with 7 other young women, and when the women started screaming, he became angry. He was upset by the fuss the women were making about it and is now taking his anger out on Sarah. I'm so surprised that there are 7 of them. I knew it was you. How in the world did you find out my secret? I wonder how, because I have nothing. My ex-husband left me 10 years ago for another woman. What? Stephen turned the tables on me over the phone and again hurled ear-splitting expletives at me, but that didn't bother me in the least. Eventually, Sarah, who was upset while we were on the phone, packed up and started a big fight with him, ignoring me on the other end of the line. I guess this is what they mean when they say things get out of hand. So I threw these last words to my ex-husband, though he may not have heard or understood them. So long, Stephen. Don't ever show up in front of me or our son again. Then I hung up the phone. In fact, the commotion caused by the women with whom he was having an affair was the idea that Michael had been talking about. After Stephen and Sarah broke into his house and he turned them away, he immediately hired a professional detective agency to find out more about them. It turned out that Stephen was cheating on Sarah here and there, and that led him to 7 other women. Moreover, he said that 3 of those 7 were married. Michael immediately informed me of this fact and even gave me Stephen and Sarah's current address and apartment, which the detective had also found out. So Michael and I told the 7 women where Stephen and Sarah were and sent them all there at once. I heard that the ensuing situation at Stephen and Sarah's apartment had caused such a fuss that the police had to be dispatched to the scene. Sarah, naturally, broke up with Stephen and he was simultaneously sued by 3 married husbands for alimony, the amount of which exceeded 3 figures. Stephen lost Sarah, his house, and his money. He is now living homeless in a park, and a colleague saw him participating in a soup kitchen. Sarah, on the other hand, like Stephen, was charged alimony in excess of 3 figures and was forced to borrow money to cover her expenses. But to her surprise, the source of the loan was a black market bank. Shortly after borrowing the money, she was suddenly taken away by scary-looking men in a car, and her whereabouts are unknown. After 10 years, I have made a final settlement with Stephen, and I am back to my peaceful life again. I am still single as ever, but as long as I can live a happy and lively life at school, that's enough for me. Later, Michael also met a woman with a child. They are now dating on the premise of marriage, and I sincerely hope that he too can find a new happiness and life.